The Dominion had ruled the stars for 200 years. Their empire stretched across 3 spiral arms of the galaxy, and their name was spoken with fear on 1,000 worlds. They were conquerors. They were destroyers. They had never known defeat. Supreme Commander stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Conquest, and watched another civilization die. Through the massive observation window, he could see the planet below burning. Great cities that had taken centuries to build were now nothing but smoke and fire. The people had tried to resist. They had sent their small fleet against the Armada. They had begged for mercy when their ships were destroyed. Now their world was paying the price for their defiance. Felt nothing as he watched. He had seen this scene play out dozens of times before. Though were the 47th species his fleet had conquered in his lifetime alone, they would not be the last. The Supreme Commander was tall even by standards, standing nearly 8 feet in height. His skin was the color of storm clouds, and his eyes were pools of absolute darkness. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. No one in the Dominion questioned his commands. No one dared. Sub-Commander approached him from across the bridge. She was younger than, but she had proven herself in dozens of campaigns. She carried a tactical display in her clawed hands, and her expression suggested she had news. "Supreme Commander," she said, bowing her head in respect, "our forward scouts have completed their survey of the next sector." Did not turn from the window, and what have they found? A single inhabited system at the edge of this spiral arm. The dominant species calls themselves humans. They occupy the 3rd planet from their star. Their military capabilities. Consulted her display. Primitive, Supreme Commander. They have achieved basic faster-than-light travel only recently. Their entire defensive fleet numbers approximately 300 vessels. Most are small patrol craft. Their largest ships are smaller than our destroyers. Now turned. His dark eyes studied the data on display. He saw images of human vessels, crude things of metal and simple energy weapons. He saw there a blue and green sphere covered mostly in water. He saw their population numbers, their military installations, their technological level. He was not impressed. "They are nothing," he said, "barely worth our attention. Shall I prepare a full conquest fleet, Supreme Commander?" Made a sound that might have been a laugh. "That would be a waste of resources. Send 20 warships. That should be more than enough to bring these humans to their knees. I want their world secured within the cycle." Bowed again. "It will be done, Supreme Commander." As she left to carry out his orders, returned his attention to the burning world below. The had possessed a fleet 3 times the size of what these humans had. They had possessed weapons that were far more advanced. They had possessed warriors who had trained for generations. None of it had mattered. The way of war was simple and brutal. They arrived in overwhelming force. They demanded surrender. When surrender was refused, they demonstrated their power by destroying military targets, then civilian centers, then anything else that remained. Eventually, every species broke. Every species surrendered. Every species learned to serve the Dominion or die. It had been this way for 200 years. It would continue this way forever. Fleet Master received his orders 3 days later. He was a veteran commander who had led conquest fleets against a dozen different species. He had never lost a ship in combat. He had never failed to bring a world to heel. When he reviewed the intelligence on humanity, he felt a flicker of disappointment. This would not be a challenge. This would be an execution. His fleet of 20 warships assembled at the edge of human space. Each vessel was a mountain of black metal, bristling with plasma lances and cannons. Each carried thousands of soldiers ready to occupy the conquered world. Each was crewed by officers who had known nothing but victory. Stood on the bridge of his flagship and addressed his fleet through the communication network. "Warriors of the Dominion, before us lies another primitive species waiting to be added to our empire. They possess nothing that can threaten us. They know nothing of true warfare. This will be a simple conquest. We will give them one chance to surrender. When they refuse, as they always do, we will crush them. Within the cycle, their world will belong to Supreme Commander." His officers responded with sounds of approval. They had heard this speech many times before. They had no doubt how this campaign would end. The fleet engaged their faster-than-light drives and vanished into the darkness between stars. Their destination was a small yellow sun at the edge of the galaxy. Their target was the third planet orbiting that sun, a world its inhabitants called Earth. They expected no resistance worthy of the name. They expected another easy victory to add to their long list of conquests. They expected these humans to break just like every other species had broken before them. They were wrong. On Earth, humanity had been watching the stars for a long time. They had found the ruins of civilizations that had been destroyed before humans had learned to make fire. They had intercepted distress signals from dying worlds. They had pieced together enough information to understand that something terrible was moving through the galaxy, consuming everything in its path. They did not know exactly what was coming for them, but they knew something was coming. In orbital shipyards around Earth, new warships were being built every day. In military academies on every continent, young men and women trained for a war they hoped would never come. In research facilities hidden beneath mountains and deserts, scientists worked on weapons that might give humanity a chance against the unknown enemy. Humanity was afraid. They had every reason to be afraid, but they were also preparing. They were building. They were getting ready. They had conquered countless species across the galaxy. They had destroyed civilizations that had existed for millions of years. They had crushed warriors who had seemed unbeatable. But they had never faced humans. They had never faced a species that had spent its entire history fighting against itself, developing ever more creative ways to wage war. They had never faced a species that treated defeat as a temporary setback rather than a final end. They had never faced a species that would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. The 20 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system. They began their approach toward Earth, confident in their superiority, certain of their victory. They had no idea what they were about to unleash. Captain Jack had served in the Earth Defense Fleet for 32 years. He had started as a young ensign on a patrol boat and worked his way up through the ranks. Now he commanded the USS Sentinel, a heavy cruiser assigned to watch the outer edges of the Sol system. It was not a glamorous posting. Most days, nothing happened. Most days, the biggest excitement was tracking asteroid movements or running training drills. This was not most days. Jack stood at the center of the Sentinel's bridge, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on the main display screen. He was a lean man with gray hair and deep lines around his eyes. His face rarely showed emotion, but inside his chest, his heart was beating faster than it had in years. "Confirm those readings, Lieutenant," he said quietly. Lieutenant Kate worked her sensor console with quick, practiced movements. She was young, barely 30, but she was the best sensor officer Jack had ever served with. Right now, her face was pale. "Readings confirmed, Captain," she said. 20 contacts dropped out of FTL travel approximately 2 million kilometers from our position. Each contact is massive. I am reading power signatures unlike anything in our database." Jack nodded slowly. They had prepared for this moment. They had trained for it. They had hoped it would never come. "Size comparison." Kate swallowed hard. "Each vessel is approximately 4 times the size of the Sentinel, sir. Their weapons signatures suggest plasma-based technology far beyond our own." Lieutenant Commander Sam looked up from the weapons console. He was a stocky man with a thick mustache and steady hands. "Captain, should I bring weapons online?" Jack considered the question. 20 ships, each 4 times the size of his own. Weapons technology beyond anything humanity possessed. If these were the aliens they had been preparing for, The Sentinel would not last 5 minutes in a direct fight. But running was not an option. Running had never been an option. "Bring weapons to standby," Jack ordered. "Do not charge them yet. Lieutenant, send an emergency message to Fleet Command. Tell them we have contact with unknown vessels. Include all sensor data." "Yes, sir." The bridge fell silent except for the soft sounds of equipment and the distant hum of the ship's engines. Every crew member knew what this moment meant. Every crew member understood that their lives might be measured in hours now. Jack thought about his wife, Maria, back on Earth. He thought about his 2 daughters, both grown now, both with families of their own. He thought about the he had only seen through video calls these past months. Then he pushed those thoughts aside. He was a captain. His crew needed him to be a captain. "Lieutenant, open a channel to the unknown vessels. Let us see if they are willing to talk." The channel opened. Jack straightened his uniform and faced the main screen. "Unknown vessels, this is Captain Jack of the Earth Defense Fleet vessel USS Sentinel. You have entered human space. Please identify yourselves and state your intentions." For a long moment, there was no response. Then the screen flickered, and Jack found himself looking at a nightmare. The alien was tall, with gray skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its eyes were completely black, like holes in reality. Its mouth was filled with teeth that looked like they had been designed for tearing flesh. When it spoke, its voice was cold and harsh, like metal scraping against stone. "I am Fleet Master of the Dominion. Your world now belongs to us. You will surrender all military vessels immediately. You will disarm all planetary defenses. You will prepare to receive Dominion occupation forces. You have 1 rotation of your planet to comply. If you do not comply, your species will be destroyed." The transmission ended. The bridge was absolutely silent. Jack stared at the screen where the alien's face had been. He had seen intelligence reports about the destroyed civilizations, about the distress signals from dying worlds. Now he knew what had done it. Now he knew what humanity was facing. Lieutenant spoke first. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Captain, what do we do?" Jack turned to face his crew. He saw fear in their eyes, but he also saw something else. He saw determination. He saw the same stubborn refusal to quit that had defined humanity since the first cave dweller had picked up a rock and decided to fight back against the darkness. "We do our duty," Jack said. "Send everything we have on these to Fleet Command. Every scan, every reading, every piece of data. Then we hold position." Sam's eyebrows rose. "Hold position, sir, against 20 ships." "We are the first line of defense, Commander. If we run, we give them a clear path to Earth. We buy time for the fleet to assemble. We buy time for our people to prepare." "Sir," Kate said carefully, "the Sentinel cannot survive against those ships. We do not have the weapons or the shields to fight them." Jack nodded. He knew she was right. He also knew it did not matter. "Lieutenant, the Navy has been defending humanity for over 400 years. Sometimes that meant winning battles. Sometimes that meant losing them. But we have never, not once, abandoned our post when people were counting on us. I do not intend to be the first captain who does." He looked around the bridge, meeting the eyes of each crew member in turn. "I will not order anyone to stay. If anyone wants to take an escape pod and head for Earth, I will not stop them. But I am staying here. This is my ship, and these aliens will not pass without going through me first." No one moved toward the escape pods. No one said a word about leaving. Instead, Sam turned back to his console and began charging the weapons. Kate started running detailed scans of the vessels, looking for any weakness they might exploit. The rest of the crew returned to their duties with quiet determination. Jack felt a swell of pride. These were good people. They deserved better than this, but they would face whatever came with their heads held high. "Send one more message to Fleet Command," he said. "Tell Admiral that the Sentinel will hold as long as possible. Tell her to make these bastards pay for every ship they destroy." The message was sent. The fleet continued its approach toward Earth, and on the bridge of a single human cruiser, a crew of men and women prepared to stand against the darkness. They did not know if they could win. They did not know if humanity had any chance at all against an empire that had conquered the galaxy. They only knew that they would not surrender. They would not run. They would fight until they could not fight anymore. It was the human way. It had always been the human way. They were about to learn that lesson the hard way. Admiral Laura had been preparing for this day her entire career. She had studied the ruins of destroyed civilizations. She had analyzed the distress signals from worlds that no longer existed. She had spent years developing strategies for fighting an enemy she had never seen. Now that enemy was here, and she had less than 20 hours to save humanity. Laura stood in the command center of the carrier USS Liberty, surrounded by holographic displays showing the positions of every ship in the Earth Defense Fleet. 300 vessels of various sizes, from small patrol boats to heavy cruisers. It was everything humanity had. Against the 20 massive warships approaching Earth, it did not seem like nearly enough. "All ships are reporting ready, Admiral," said Commander Ben Wright, her chief tactical officer. He was a thin man with glasses and a calm voice that never seemed to change no matter how bad things got. "Fleet is assembled in defensive formation around Earth orbit. The Sentinel is still holding position at the edge of the system." Laura studied the display. Captain had refused 3 orders to withdraw. His ship was damaged from a probing attack by scouts, but he was still out there, watching the enemy approach, sending back tactical data. "What have we learned about their ships?" she asked. Ben pulled up a detailed analysis. "Their armor is incredibly dense. Our standard weapons will have difficulty penetrating it. Their shields are energy-based and extremely powerful. Their plasma weapons have a longer range than anything we have." Weaknesses. Their shields seem to be designed primarily against energy weapons. They may be less effective against kinetic projectiles. Also, their sensors are optimized for detecting advanced technology. They may have blind spots when it comes to simpler systems. Laura nodded slowly. An idea was forming in her mind. It was desperate. It was dangerous. It might get a lot of people killed, but it was the only chance they had. "Commander, how many nuclear mines do we have in storage?" Ben blinked in surprise. "Nuclear mines, Admiral. We have several hundred. They were designed for asteroid defense." "Have them deployed in a field between the Sentinel's position and Earth. Make them look like debris from a destroyed ship. Program them to detonate on proximity." "Admiral, those mines are primitive. They will surely detect them." Laura smiled grimly. "Will they? Their sensors are designed to find advanced technology. Nuclear weapons are 300 years old. They might not even recognize them as a threat." Ben stared at her for a moment, then a slow smile spread across his face. "I will have the mines deployed within 6 hours, Admiral." The hours passed quickly. The nuclear mines were deployed. The fleet took up defensive positions. Last messages were sent to families on Earth. Last prayers were offered to whatever gods people believed in. And then the deadline expired. Fleet Master watched the human fleet from his flagship's bridge. He felt something close to contempt. 300 ships, most of them barely worth noticing. Did these creatures really think they could stand against the Dominion? "All ships advance," he commanded. "Destroy anything that resists. I want them secured before the next cycle." The 20 warships moved forward in perfect formation. Their shields glowed with power. Their weapons charged with deadly energy. They had done this countless times before. They expected no surprises. The first surprise came when a destroyer entered the minefield. The ship's sensors detected the floating objects ahead, but they were classified as debris, primitive metal containers, nothing to worry about. The destroyer continued forward without slowing. The nuclear mines detonated in a chain reaction. For a moment, the space around the destroyer turned into a miniature sun. The ship's shields, designed to stop plasma bolts and energy beams, struggled against the raw kinetic force of multiple nuclear explosions. Systems overloaded. Hull plates buckled. Engines flickered and died. The destroyer emerged from the explosion field wounded. Its shields were down. Its hull was damaged. It was still alive, but it was vulnerable. And the USS Sentinel was waiting. Captain Jack had positioned his ship perfectly. The moment the destroyer's shields failed, he gave the order. All weapons fire. The Sentinels sent tungsten slugs screaming through space at a fraction of the speed of light. They struck the damaged destroyer's hull with devastating force, punching through armor that had never been breached before. Missile batteries followed, sending warheads into the gaps created by the rounds. The destroyer tried to return fire, but its systems were failing. It tried to raise its shields, but the generators were destroyed. It tried to call for help, but the Sentinel's next volley tore through its communication arrays. Then the destroyer exploded. Across both fleets, silence fell. Every sensor recorded what had happened. Every screen showed the debris expanding into space where a warship had been moments before. For the first time in over a century, a warship had been destroyed in combat. Fleet Master stared at the debris field in disbelief. "Impossible," he whispered. "That is impossible." But it had happened. The evidence was floating in space before him. One of his ships was gone, destroyed by primitives with nuclear explosives and metal projectiles. On the bridge of the USS Liberty, Admiral Laura allowed herself a single moment of fierce satisfaction. Then she opened a channel to the entire fleet. "All ships, this is Admiral, you just saw what happened. They can be hurt. They can be killed. They are not gods. They are not invincible. They are just another enemy, and humanity has never lost a war against any enemy. Now let us show these bastards what happens when they threaten our home." The human fleet surged forward to meet the battle that followed would be remembered for generations. It would be taught in military academies across the galaxy. It would become legend. They had conquered countless worlds with ease. They had destroyed civilizations that had existed for millions of years. They had never faced an enemy that did not break before their might. They had never faced humans. And on this day, above the blue waters and green lands of Earth, they learned why that was a terrible mistake. The battle above Earth was chaos and fire and death. Plasma bolts tore through space like angry stars. Missiles streaked between ships trailing white smoke. Rounds punched holes through armor and hull and flesh. Ships exploded. Ships burned. Ships died. Fleet Master had recovered from his initial shock. He was angry now, angrier than he had ever been in his long career. A warship had been destroyed. His ship, his warriors, destroyed by creatures who should have been begging for mercy. "All vessels attack Pattern Supreme," he commanded. "Concentrate fire on their largest ships. Show them the price of defiance." The fleet responded with brutal efficiency. 19 warships turned their weapons on the human formation. Plasma lances struck the heavy cruisers first. The USS Defiant vanished in a ball of fire. The USS Courage broke apart under concentrated fire. The USS Guardian lasted only seconds longer before its reactor went critical. Admiral Laura watched her ships die and felt her heart break, but she did not waver. She could not waver, not now, not ever. "Maintain formation," she ordered. "Keep firing. Every hit counts. Every minute we hold gives Earth more time to prepare." The humans fought back with everything they had. Hammered shields. Missiles found gaps in enemy armor. Nuclear warheads detonated against hulls that had never been touched by human weapons before. A second destroyer fell, its engines torn apart by a coordinated strike from 5 human frigates. A third was crippled when its bridge was destroyed by a lucky round. A fourth lost its main weapons when a damaged human cruiser rammed directly into its weapon arrays. But for every ship that fell, dozens of human vessels were destroyed. The space above Earth became a graveyard of twisted metal and frozen bodies. The human fleet was being torn apart. Lieutenant Commander Amy Torres found herself in command of the destroyer USS Valor when a plasma bolt killed her captain and most of the bridge crew. She was 28 years old. She had never commanded anything larger than a shuttle. Now she was responsible for 150 lives and a ship that was falling apart around her. "Damage report," she called out, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "Shields gone. Hull breaches on decks 4 through 7, engines at 40%, weapons still operational." Amy looked at the tactical display. 3 cruisers were advancing toward the USS Liberty. If they reached the carrier, Admiral would die. The command structure would collapse. The battle would be lost. The Valor was between those cruisers and the Liberty. Amy understood what she had to do. She understood that it would cost her everything. "All hands, this is the acting captain. We are moving to intercept the enemy cruisers advancing on the Liberty. I am not going to lie to you. We probably will not survive this. But if we can buy the Admiral even a few minutes, it will be worth it. Anyone who wants to take an escape pod has my permission. No one will think less of you." She paused, waited. No one moved toward the escape pods. "Very well, helm, bring us about. All weapons prepare to fire. Let us show these aliens how humans die." The Valor turned into the path of the 3 cruisers. It was a small ship, already damaged, already dying. Against 3 enemy vessels, it had no chance at all. It held for 4 minutes. 4 minutes of constant fire from weapons that should have been able to destroy the destroyer in seconds. 4 minutes of a crew refusing to give up even as their ship burned around them. 4 minutes of Amy Torres standing at the center of her bridge, calling out orders, keeping her people focused, keeping them fighting. When the Valor finally broke apart, the USS Liberty had escaped. Admiral was alive. The battle continued. Amy Torres never knew if her sacrifice had mattered. She never knew if the extra minutes she had bought had made any difference. She only knew that she had done her duty. That was enough. Across the battlefield, similar scenes played out again and again. Commander Hall ordered his crew to abandon the frigate USS Dawn, then piloted the empty ship alone into a battleship's engine section. The explosion crippled the massive vessel. Lieutenant Peter, the last survivor of the cruiser USS Phoenix, manually targeted his ship's remaining missiles while bleeding from a dozen wounds. His final salvo destroyed a destroyer's shield generator. Ensign Maria, barely out of the academy, took command of a damage control team when all the senior officers were killed. She led her people through burning corridors and radiation leaks to repair a critical power conduit. Her ship survived. She did not. The humans died. They died by the hundreds. They died by the thousands. But they did not stop fighting. They did not surrender. They did not run. And slowly, impossibly, the tide of battle began to turn. They had expected an easy victory. They had expected the humans to break after the first hour, to beg for mercy after the first day. Instead, they found an enemy that seemed to grow stronger the more they were hurt. An enemy that smiled as they died. An enemy that used their final moments to strike one more blow against the invaders. Fleet Master watched his tactical display with growing disbelief. 8 of his warships were destroyed. 4 more were crippled. His fleet, which had conquered dozens of worlds without losing a single vessel, had been mauled by primitives. "Fleet Master," his second-in-command said quietly, "we have lost nearly half our force. If we continue this engagement, we may not have enough ships to return home." Said nothing. His clawed hands gripped the railing of his command platform so hard that the metal bent. "Fleet Master, we must withdraw. We can return with a larger force. We can still conquer this world." The words tasted like poison but knew they were true. He had lost. For the first time in his career, for the first time in living memory, a fleet had lost. "All ships disengage," he said. The words hurt more than any wound he had ever suffered. "Set course for Dominion space. We are withdrawing." As the surviving ships turned and fled, the human fleet did not pursue. They were too damaged, too exhausted, too few. But they had won. Against all odds, against an enemy that had never been defeated, they had won. Admiral Laura stood on the bridge of the USS Liberty, surrounded by the wreckage of her fleet, and allowed herself to weep. For the dead, for the survivors, for a victory that had cost so much. The would return, she knew that. This was not the end. But it was a beginning. Supreme Commander received the news in the throne room of his flagship. He stood alone in the vast chamber, surrounded by trophies from 100 conquered worlds, and listened as Fleet Master delivered his report through the communication screen. 8 warships destroyed, 4 crippled beyond repair, over 15,000 warriors dead, and the human remained unconquered. Hal asked when finished speaking. His voice was quiet, but there was something dangerous beneath the calm. How did this happen? His image flickered on the screen. The Fleet Master looked older than he had before the battle. There were new lines on his gray face, new shadows in his black eyes. "Supreme Commander, these humans are unlike any species we have encountered before. They do not fight like rational beings. When their ships are destroyed, they continue to resist. When they charge forward instead of retreating. When they are dying, they use their final moments to strike at us rather than trying to survive." "Every species resists at first," said. "Every species breaks eventually." "These did not break, Supreme Commander. We killed thousands of them. We destroyed most of their fleet, and they kept fighting. They kept fighting until we were forced to withdraw." Paused. "I have served the Dominion for 90 years. I have conquered 23 worlds. I have never seen anything like this. These humans are insane." Said nothing for a long moment. He thought about the Dominion's long history of conquest. He thought about the countless species that had fallen before might. He thought about the empire that had stood unchallenged for 2 centuries. And he thought about a small blue world at the edge of the galaxy, where that empire had suffered its first defeat. "We will send a larger fleet," he said finally. 50 warships. I want those humans crushed. I want their world burned. I want their species erased from existence." "It will be done, Supreme Commander." The communication ended. Stood alone in his throne room, surrounded by the symbols of power, and for the first time in his long life, he felt something he had never felt before. He felt doubt. The news of the battle spread across the galaxy like fire through dry grass. They tried to suppress it. They executed messengers who carried the story. They destroyed communication relays that transmitted the details. They threatened death to anyone who spoke of what had happened. But they could not stop the truth. On 100 occupied worlds, beings who had long since given up hope heard the story of the human victory. They heard about the small fleet that had stood against the Dominion Armada. They heard about the ships that had sacrificed themselves to protect there. They heard about the enemy that had been forced to retreat for the first time in living memory. The who had served the Dominion as slaves for 3 generations began to whisper among themselves. The whose world had been conquered a century ago started to gather in secret meetings. The collective, which had surrendered without a fight when they arrived, began to remember what courage looked like. A single word spread from world to world, from species to species, from heart to heart. Resistance. On Earth, humanity was rebuilding. The shipyards that had been damaged in the battle were repaired and expanded. New vessels were being constructed at a pace that would have seemed impossible before the war. New weapons were being developed. New strategies were being planned. Captain Jack spent 3 months in a military hospital, recovering from the injuries he had suffered when the USS Sentinel was finally destroyed. The ship had held its position until the very end, buying precious time for the fleet to regroup. When it finally broke apart, Jack had been pulled from the wreckage more dead than alive. He had survived. Not all of his crew had been so lucky. When reporters came to interview him, they asked why he had refused to retreat, why he had stayed in a battle he could not win, why he had risked everything against impossible odds. Jack thought about his crew. He thought about the men and women who had stood beside him on that bridge, who had fought and died so that others might live. He thought about Lieutenant Kate, who had kept the sensors running until a plasma bolt took her life. He thought about Lieutenant Commander Sam, who had refused to leave the weapons console even when the ship was burning around him. "We are humans," Jack said simply. "We do not go quietly." 6 months after the first battle, the returned. 50 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system. It was the largest fleet they had ever sent against a single world. It should have been enough to crush any resistance. They found 300 new ships waiting for them. Humanity had not wasted the time the first battle had bought them. Every shipyard had worked around the clock. Every factory had produced weapons and armor and equipment. Every academy had trained new officers and crew. The fleet that faced them was larger than before, better armed than before, and crewed by men and women who had learned something important from the first battle. They could be hurt, they could be killed. They were not gods, they were not invincible, they were just another enemy. And humanity had never lost a war against any enemy. The second battle lasted 3 days. It was brutal and bloody and costly. Thousands more humans died. Dozens of ships were destroyed. But when it was over, the armada was shattered. Only a handful of ships escaped to carry word of the defeat back to Dominion space. Admiral Laura stood on the bridge of the newly commissioned USS Sentinel II and watched the last enemy vessels flee. Around her, the surviving ships of the human fleet held formation. They were damaged. They were exhausted. They were victorious. "What now, Admiral?" asked Commander Ben Wright. Laura looked at the stars spread out before her. Somewhere out there, 100 species waited in chains. Somewhere out there, billions of beings lived in fear of an empire that had seemed invincible. "Now we go to them," she said. "We find the worlds they have conquered. We teach them what we learned. We show them that the Dominion can be beaten." She turned to face her crew. "They conquered the galaxy because no one believed they could be stopped. We proved them wrong. Now it is time to share that truth with everyone else." The fleet began to move, not toward Earth, not toward safety, but outward into the darkness between stars, toward an enemy that had ruled unchallenged for 200 years. They had conquered worlds with ease. They had built an empire on fear and death, and the certainty that no one could stand against them. They had never met humans. Now they had, and nothing in the galaxy would ever be the same again.